question that arises quite often, especially lately, with the upcoming release of my latest record, is what exactly the album's title, Martial Law, is in reference to. As anyone who knows me personally, or musically for that matter, knows, I am very outspoken when it comes to liberty, freedom, national sovereignty, and politics in general, really. The topic of martial law is one that I find quite intriguing as a Canadian. Martial law is the imposition of military rule by military authorities over designated regions on an emergency basis, whether natural, like a flood or earthquake, or man-made, such as a false flag operation like 9/11 or the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995. In February of 2010, I released my EP Martial Law, the first one. It was only half political. It was more of a social test, really, to see what type of response it would have on the local community. The response was astoundingly positive, so I decided at the end of 2012 to start work on Martial Law 2. Now, Martial Law 2 will be a full-length album and will entirely be political. So why is it that I've chosen martial law, of all topics, to focus on? Here's why. United States Northern Command, or NORTHCOM. NORTHCOM was created on April 25, 2002, when then U.S. President George W. Bush approved a new Unified Command Plan following the September 11th attacks. USNORTHCOM went operational on October 1st, 2002. NORTHCOM is a Unified Combatant Command of the U.S. military with the task of providing military support for civil authorities in the United States and protecting the territory and national interests of the United States within the contiguous United States, Alaska, Mexico, Canada, and the air, land, and sea that approaches these areas. Did you catch that? Protecting the national interests of the United States within the U.S., Alaska, Mexico, and Canada. Let that sink in for a second. NORTHCOM's area of responsibility, or AOR, includes air, land, and sea, approaches and encompasses the contiguous United States, Alaska, Canada, and Mexico, and the surrounding water out to approximately 500 nautical miles, or 930 kilometers. The support in which NORTHCOM can provide to civil authorities is supposedly legally limited by the Posse Comitatus Act, which states that the military is not to be operational domestically. However, in case of national emergency, natural or man-made, its Air Force's Northern National Security Emergency Preparedness Directorate will take charge of the situation or event. NORTHCOM headquarters has approximately 1,200 uniformed and civilian members, a few permanent forces. Forces from all branches of the U.S. military may be assigned to the command as needed to complete its mission. Northern Command has created several classified concept plans that are intended to address the 15 national planning scenarios that NORTHCOM must be prepared to respond to. Of course, as stated, all 15 of these aforementioned plans are classified, and we, as citizens, are unaware of their specific details. For anyone doubting that this operation is currently functional, even Wikipedia has stated that, quote, NORTHCOM operates extensive domestic intelligence operations which both share and receive information from local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. Employees of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, Central Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and other agencies maintain offices at NORTHCOM and receive daily intelligence briefings. Northern Command has completed several joint training exercises with local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. The Military Commissions Act of 2006 lifted many restrictions placed on the military to support civilian administration by the Posse Comitatus Act. However, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in June of 2008 that significant portions of the MCA were unconstitutional. The John Mortar Defense Authorization Act of 2007, or H.R. 5122, effectively nullified the limits of the Insurrection Act when it passed. However, the bill was amended in 2008. So what does this mean for Canadians, you may be asking? Well, On February 14, 2008, Canada and the United States signed an agreement which allows for the deployment of U.S. troops inside Canada. There was no official announcement, nor was there a formal decision at the governmental level. In fact, the agreement was barely mentioned by the Bilderberg-run Canadian media. The agreement, which raises far-reaching issues of national sovereignty, was not between the two governments. It was signed by military commanding officers. On page 8 of NORTHCOM's Civil Assistance Plan, signed with Canada Command on February 14th, in Concept of Operations, it states that cross-border movement of military resources is authorized for training and exercises in preparation for bilateral military-to-military civil support. It's one thing for us to be training U.S. soldiers for Afghanistan and Calgary, another to have military civil support teams coming and going across the border for regular exercises that, under most circumstances, will only require civilian response to handle, such as police, firefighters, medical services. While a formal agreement was reached in February 2008, the decision to allow the deployment of U.S. troops in Canada was announced in April 2002 by former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Territorial control over Canada is part of Washington's geopolitical and military agenda as formulated in April 2002 by Donald Rumsfeld. And may I add, the exact same Donald Rumsfeld who, on September 10, 2001, held a press conference stating that the Pentagon had misplaced trillions of dollars. These records, naturally, were stored in the section of the Pentagon which was supposedly hit by a plane during the 9/11 attacks the following day. The very same Donald Rumsfeld, who through his work with G.D. Searle and Company, was able to get the toxic artificial sweetener aspartame passed by the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, in the 1970s. He also played an instrumental role in the acquisition of G.D. Searle and Company by, of course, Monsanto, everyone's favorite. Rumsfeld is said to have boasted that the NORTHCOM, with all of North America as its geographic command, is part of the greatest transformation of the Unified Command Plan since its inception in 1947. Following Prime Minister Jacques Chrétien's refusal to join NORTHCOM, a high-level so-called Consultative Binational Planning Group, or BPG, operating out of Peterson Air Force Base, was set up in late 2002 with a mandate to, quote, prepare contingency plans to respond to land and sea threats and attacks and other major emergencies in Canada or the United States, end quote. The BPG's mandate goes far beyond the jurisdiction of a consultative military body making recommendations to government. In practice, it is neither accountable to the U.S. Congress nor to the Canadian House of Commons. The BPG has a staff of 50 American and Canadian military planners who have been working diligently in laying the groundwork for the integration of Canada-U.S. military command structures. The BPG works in close coordination with the Canada-U.S. Military Corporation and the Pentagon, a so-called panel responsible for detailed joint military planning. To many, this sounds a lot like the proposed North American Union, or NAU, which is being developed and has been discussed for over a century between the United States, Mexico, and Canada to create a borderless community much like the European Union. The Canadian dollar, American dollar, and Mexican peso would all be replaced by the Amero currency, a huge loss of national sovereignty and a very obvious push towards a one-world government. And we mustn't forget the quotes of our former and current Prime Ministers, Paul Martin, who said, "We're all going to have to give up a little bit of our sovereignty in order to make the world work," and Stephen Harper, who said, "In a globalized economy, we are going to have to take global responsibilities, and there is going to have to be some semblance of global governance on these questions." So there you have our past two Prime Ministers talking about global governance. Under an integrated North American command, a North American national security doctrine would be formulated. Canada would be obliged to embrace Washington's preemptive military doctrine, including the use of nuclear warheads as a means of self-defense, which was ratified by the U.S. Senate in December 2003. So there you have it, in somewhat of a nutshell, a bit of a long nutshell. This is the thinking behind the upcoming release of my album Martial Law 2. Aside from martial law, the album also focuses on topics such as the New World Order, Illuminati, Bilderberg Group, Bohemian Grove, Agenda 21, the Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission, Skull and Bones, Economics, Education, Global Warming, Eugenics, Population Control, and many other topics. The album will be dropping in early April and available for free download at www.sonaztee.com. It's SONAZTEE.com. Peace and love, it's Nasty, and I'm out.